There is a question that nobody wants to ask out loud, because the moment you ask it, you feel like a bad person. The question is this: what if everything you were taught about kindness is slowly killing you? Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Literally, what if the very habits that were praised by your parents, celebrated by your teachers, and rewarded by society are the exact same habits that are draining your energy, suffocating your ambitions, poisoning your relationships, and leaving you empty in a way you cannot quite name? Think about the last time someone asked you for a favor, a friend who needed you to cover for them, a co-worker who dumped their workload on your desk with a smile, a family member who called at midnight with a crisis that somehow became your responsibility to solve. You said yes. You always say yes. And in that moment you felt a flicker of something warm, the satisfaction of being needed, of being good, of being the kind of person people can count on. But here is what nobody talks about. That warmth fades, and what replaces it is something colder and heavier, a quiet exhaustion, a creeping resentment, the slow, uncomfortable realization that you have given so much of yourself to others that when you finally look inward, there is almost nothing left. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers who ever lived, a man who ruled the Roman Empire and carried the weight of an entire civilization on his shoulders, wrote something in his private journals that was never meant to be read by anyone else. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was not talking about being cold or selfish. He was talking about something much more dangerous than cruelty. He was warning against the slow self-destruction that comes from giving without boundaries, from confusing sacrifice with virtue, and from mistaking the approval of others for inner peace. The Stoics understood something about human nature that most of us spend our entire lives refusing to accept. They understood that kindness without wisdom is not kindness at all. It is weakness wearing a noble mask. And weakness in this world is not rewarded, it is exploited. Today we are going to pull that mask off. We are going to look at 10 ways that being too kind is quietly destroying your life. And then we are going to talk about what the Stoics, the psychologists, and some of history's most powerful minds actually did about it. Stay with this, because what you are about to hear might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to you. The first way kindness destroys you is so subtle that most people never see it happening. It works like this. When you are consistently kind, when you consistently give, help, accommodate, and sacrifice, you begin to develop what psychologists call an inflated expectation of reciprocity. You expect somewhere deep in your unconscious mind that because you have given so much, the universe, or at least the people around you, will give back in equal measure. You do not say this out loud. You might not even be fully aware that you believe it. But the belief is there, embedded in your behavior like a splinter beneath the skin. And then life does what life always does. It does not return what you gave. The friend you drove to the airport a dozen times cannot find the time to pick up the phone when you are going through something difficult. The colleague whose career you propped up with your advice and your energy gets the promotion you deserved. The partner you poured yourself into for years looks at you one day with tired eyes and says they feel disconnected. And the feeling that rises in your chest in that moment is not just sadness. It is something more dangerous. It is betrayal. And betrayal, when it comes from expectations that were never spoken and never agreed to, is one of the most psychologically destructive emotions a human being can experience. Epictetus knew this. He was a Stoic philosopher who was born into slavery, who lived in chains, who had every reason to be broken by the cruelty of the world. And yet he wrote, Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. He was not telling you to stop caring. He was telling you that when you attach your emotional well-being to what other people do or do not do for you, you have handed them the remote control to your entire inner life. You have made them the author of your happiness. And people, even good people, will always disappoint you, not because they are cruel, but because they are human, and they are busy, and they are dealing with their own shadows. The Stoic solution is not to stop giving. It is to give without the hidden invoice. Give because it reflects your values, not because you are running a transaction. Because the moment your generosity becomes a loan in disguise, you have not been kind at all. You have been manipulative. And the person who suffers most from that manipulation is you. The second destruction that kindness brings is so common that it has become almost invisible. We have a word for it in psychology, learned helplessness. But in this context, it works in reverse. It is not you who becomes helpless. It is the people around you, and you are the one who created the condition. Here is how it happens. Every time you solve someone's problem for them, every time you step in before they have had the chance to struggle, every time you answer before they have had the chance to think, you are sending them a message. The message is, you cannot do this without me. And the terrifying thing is, after long enough, they start to believe it. The Roman philosopher Seneca, who was not only one of the greatest Stoic minds in history, but also one of the wealthiest and most politically powerful men in Rome, wrote this in one of his letters. It is not that I am brave, that I endure. It is that I refuse to allow what is external to disturb what is internal. He spent his life observing power, and what he observed was this. The people who are constantly rescued never develop the muscles to stand on their own, and worse, they resent you for it, even as they depend on you. Because somewhere beneath the comfort of being carried is the deep, humiliating awareness that they need to be carried at all. Think about the parent who does their child's homework every night, the manager who rewrites every email their team member sends, the friend who always pays, always plans, always shows up with solutions. In each case, there is a kindness on the surface. But beneath the surface, there is a slow erosion of someone else's capability, confidence, and dignity. And then one day, the person you have been helping walks away, or turns on you, or takes everything you have given and disappears, and you are left asking how this could have happened when the answer was there the whole time. You robbed them of the very struggle that would have made them capable of being your equal. And people do not love those who make them feel small, even when the smallness comes wrapped in generosity. The third way that being too kind will destroy you is one that most kind people deny with a ferocity that is almost comical. They will argue with you. They will list their achievements, their productivity, their full calendar, and their busy schedule. But listen carefully, because what I am about to say is backed by decades of psychological research and confirmed by the experience of every person who has finally hit the wall. When you consistently put other people's needs, goals, and desires before your own, you are not being selfless. You are running from yourself. This is not a comfortable thing to hear. But ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat alone in a quiet room with no task to complete and no one to help, and just existed? Not scrolling, not planning, not solving someone else's problem, just sitting with yourself. If that thought makes you uncomfortable, if it creates a faint anxiety, a need to find something to do, someone to call, somewhere to be, then what you are experiencing is not a personality trait. It is a symptom. The psychologist Carl Jung, who spent his career mapping the interior landscape of the human mind, wrote about what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. He observed that many people bury themselves in busyness and giving not because they love giving, but because stillness forces them to confront the parts of themselves they are most afraid of. The fear, the grief, the ambition they abandoned, the voice that says, quietly and persistently, that they are not enough. Marcus Aurelius dealt with this privately. In his meditations, he wrote repeatedly about the temptation to seek validation from the outside world, and he identified it as one of the most corrupting forces a person could allow into their life. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect, he wrote. He understood that self-abandonment, even in the name of virtue, is still abandonment. The Stoics were clear. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, but they went further than that. They argued that a life spent in service to others while avoiding the harder work of self-examination is not a virtuous life. It is an escape, and escapes, no matter how noble they appear, always end in the same place, with you alone, facing what you were running from. Except now it is bigger, and you are more exhausted, and you have less time. The fourth destruction that kindness brings you might find the hardest to accept, because it requires you to confront something about the way the world actually works, as opposed to the way you wish it worked. The world does not respect you for being endlessly available. It does not honor you for being the person who never says no. It does not feel gratitude, deep and lasting gratitude, for the person who is always there. What the world does, what people do, reliably, consistently, almost without exception, is test the boundaries of what is available to them. And when they find no boundary, they keep going. Psychologists have a term for this in behavioral science. It is called the scarcity principle. Things that are rare are perceived as valuable. Things that are abundant are taken for granted. This is not a theory. It is one of the most robustly replicated findings in the study of human behavior, and it applies to you. When you are always available, you become furniture. When you always say yes, your yes means nothing. When you always give, your giving stops being a gift and starts being an expectation. And the moment it becomes an expectation, the moment it is treated as furniture, you have lost something that is almost impossible to get back: your perceived value in the eyes of the people around you. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about living according to reason rather than impulse. The impulse is to help, to give, to be needed. The reason, the cold, clear, unsentimentalized reason, is that being endlessly generous without boundaries does not make people love you more. It makes them respect you less. History gives us a perfect case study in this. Abraham Lincoln, who is remembered as one of the most morally principled leaders in American history, was also ruthlessly strategic about when to extend grace and when to hold firm. He understood, with an almost stoic clarity, that there is a difference between genuine compassion and compulsive accommodation. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." He was not talking about trees. He was talking about the power of deliberate, bounded action. He was talking about the difference between giving with intention and giving out of an inability to refuse. Say no, not always, not cruelly, but strategically, with clarity and with calm. Because every time you say no to something that diminishes you, you are saying yes to something that builds you. And the people worth keeping in your life will not leave because you have a spine. They will respect you more for it. The fifth way that excessive kindness destroys you is one that plays out so slowly you might be decades into it before you realize what has happened to your social world. When you are known as the giver, as the helper, as the one who is always there, you begin to attract a very specific type of person, not a random sample of humanity, a curated selection. You attract people who are looking for someone to give to them. and over time, the people in your life begin to skew heavily in one direction. Takers. This is not a moral judgment on those people. Some of them are genuinely going through difficult times. Some of them have simply never been taught to reciprocate, because no one in their life ever required it of them. But the effect on you is the same, regardless of the cause. You end up surrounded by people who drain you, and you find yourself mysteriously, inexplicably alone in moments when you are the one who needs something. The ancient Stoics were deeply interested in the question of friendship. Aristotle, who was not a Stoic, but who influenced much of what the Stoics later developed, wrote extensively about what he called true friendship, as opposed to what he called friendships of utility or pleasure. He argued that most of what we call friendship is actually a transaction. People are together because one person needs what the other person provides, and the moment that provision stops, the friendship ends. This is not cynicism, it is observation. And if you look honestly at your own circle, you will see it. The people who call when they need something and go silent when they do not. The people who show up for your abundance and disappear during your scarcity. The people who celebrate with you, but are never there when things get hard. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius. Withdraw into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve. He was prescribing a radical curation of your social world, not isolation, not coldness, but the deliberate, rational choice to invest your energy in people who invest back, because your energy is finite, your time is finite, and who you give it to is one of the most consequential decisions you will ever make. The sixth destruction that kindness brings is one of the darkest, and it is the one that people most desperately want to believe is not true. Here it is. When you are too kind, people do not just take advantage of you. They start to suspect your motives, and they begin to distrust you. This sounds backwards. It sounds like the cruelest possible irony. But think about it from the outside. When someone is excessively, unconditionally, relentlessly kind, the rational observer, and most people, beneath their emotional reactions, are rational observers, begins to wonder why. Because in the real world, unconditional generosity is rare, and things that are rare and valuable do not usually come without a cost. So when something appears to come for free, the natural question is, what am I not seeing? What is this person getting out of this? What do they want? You have probably done this yourself. You have probably met someone who was almost aggressively nice, who complimented everything and accommodated everyone, and never seemed to have a bad day or a selfish thought, and you felt, somewhere beneath the pleasantness, a faint and uncomfortable suspicion. You did not know what to call it. But it was there. The psychologist Robert Cialdini, in his landmark work on the science of influence, found that people are actually more comfortable with and more trusting of those who express both positive and negative qualities than those who present as uniformly positive. The technical term for this is the pratfall effect, and what it demonstrates is that perceived perfection creates distance, while perceived humanity creates connection. The Stoics understood this instinctively. Marcus Aurelius did not pretend in his journals. He wrestled, he doubted, he expressed frustration and fatigue and self-criticism. He was not performing virtue, he was practicing it, imperfectly, honestly, in the full view of his own conscience. And that honesty, that willingness to be imperfect, is what makes his writing feel true 2,000 years later. Be honest. Be imperfect. Let people see that you have limits, that you have preferences, that you sometimes say no, and sometimes feel tired, and sometimes put yourself first. Because the alternative, the performance of limitless goodness, does not make you lovable, it makes you suspicious. And in a world where trust is the most valuable currency, that suspicion will cost you everything. The seventh way that kindness destroys you reaches into something darker, something that lives beneath the surface of everyday life, and something that a surprising number of endlessly giving people will recognize immediately when they hear it. When shortage becomes a way of life, the hunger for relief becomes overwhelming, and people who are chronically depleted are chronically vulnerable to addiction. This is not speculation. The clinical literature on burnout, codependency, and addiction shows a consistent pattern. People who identify strongly as helpers, caretakers, and givers have elevated rates of substance use, disordered eating, compulsive behaviors, and other forms of self-medication, not because they are weak, but because the nervous system can only tolerate so much depletion before it demands a shortcut to relief. Carl Jung, again, put his finger on something essential here when he wrote, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism." He was pointing at the darkest version of this pattern, the person who is addicted not to a substance, but to the act of giving itself, who cannot stop giving not because they have so much to offer, but because stopping would force them to sit with the emptiness, because the giving has become the drug, the distraction, the way of not feeling what they are most afraid to feel. Seneca wrote, "Begin at once to live, and count each separate day as a separate life." He was talking about presence, about the choice to be here, in this moment, in your own body and your own experience, rather than perpetually escaping into service, into busyness, into the exhausting performance of being endlessly needed. If you are the person who is always there for everyone else, and you find yourself reaching for a glass, or a screen, or another biscuit, or another late night, ask yourself an honest question. What are you not feeling? What would you have to sit with if you stopped? Because the answer to that question is not the problem. It is the beginning of the solution. The eighth destruction that kindness causes is one that strikes at the heart of the one thing most kind people say they care about above all else, their relationships. There is a paradox at the center of excessive kindness. The more you give to someone, the more likely you are to silently, steadily, invisibly begin to resent them. Not because they are bad, not because your love for them is false, but because resentment is what happens to unexpressed needs. It is what happens when you give and give and give, and never once say what you need in return, and slowly the giving begins to feel like a debt the other person owes you, a debt they do not even know they have, and you watch them live their life with a kind of freedom you have forgotten how to feel, and the warmth that was once there curdles into something sharp. The psychologist Harriet Lerner, who spent decades studying patterns in intimate relationships, wrote, "We cannot make another person change, but when we change our own behavior, the relationship must change too." She was pointing at the hidden engine of relational dysfunction, not cruelty, not indifference, but the failure to be honest about what you need. The Stoics had a concept they called oikeiosis, a word that roughly translates to appropriate connection or belonging. It was their understanding that genuine human relationship is built not on self-erasure, but on self-disclosure, not on hiding what you are to make yourself more acceptable, but on showing what you are clearly enough that the right people can actually find you. When you are endlessly accommodating, when you shape yourself to fit whatever the other person needs, when you never assert your preferences or name your limits, you do not create intimacy. You create a mirror, and people cannot truly love a mirror. They can only look into it. They can only see themselves. And sooner or later, even that becomes lonely. Say what you need, not as a demand, not as an ultimatum, but as an honest offering of who you actually are, because the people who stay when they see the real you are the only ones worth keeping. The ninth destruction may be the most existential, the one that operates at the level of your entire life's direction rather than any individual relationship or habit. When you spend years, sometimes decades, prioritizing everyone else's goals, dreams, and timelines, something happens to your own. They do not disappear overnight. They fade, slowly, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. One day the image is vivid and detailed. A year later, it is bleached and faint. Another year, and you are not even sure what you are looking at. There is a name for what is left behind. It is called a deferred life, and it is one of the great unspoken tragedies of the human experience. The palliative care nurse Bronnie Ware, who spent years sitting with people in the final weeks of their lives and recording what they said, found that the most common regret among the dying was not something dramatic. It was this: I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Not I wish I had been kinder, not I wish I had given more. The most common regret was self-abandonment, the slow, voluntary, socially celebrated surrender of their own path in favor of someone else's. Marcus Aurelius, even as Emperor of Rome, even surrounded by people whose every need he was expected to serve, wrote in his Meditations a private reminder that rings across 2,000 years. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. He was talking about the insanity of a life spent performing a role rather than inhabiting your own story. You have a story. It is yours, not your parents', not your partner's, not your colleagues'. Yours. And every time you sacrifice a piece of your own path to walk a stretch of someone else's, that story gets a little shorter, a little less vivid, a little more like someone else's life. The Stoics were not advocating for selfishness. They were advocating for something rarer and harder, the disciplined, intentional daily practice of remaining the author of your own life, even while being genuinely present and caring for others. These are not contradictions, but they require something that excessive kindness erodes. They require the courage to choose yourself first. The 10th and final destruction that kindness brings is the one that closes the circle. It is the one that makes the whole pattern make sense. And it is this: you cannot sustain what you are doing. Nobody can. Kindness without boundaries is not a personality type. It is not a gift. It is not a spiritual achievement. It is a resource misallocation operating at the speed of life. And like every resource misallocation, it ends the same way: in collapse. The human nervous system was not designed for chronic self-sacrifice. The human heart was not built for indefinite giving without receiving. The human mind cannot indefinitely process the emotional weight of everyone else's problems while ignoring its own. The Stoics spoke often about what they called the reserve clause, the principle that in everything you do it fully, you do it with commitment, but you hold in your mind the awareness that you are also a finite being with finite resources, and that protecting those resources is not selfishness. It is wisdom. It is, in fact, the precondition for all the good you want to do in the world. Think about what happens to a doctor who never sleeps, or a teacher who never rests, or a parent who never refuels. They do not become more giving. They become less. They become brittle, resentful, erratic, and eventually unable to give anything at all. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most physically and intellectually vigorous leaders America ever produced, had a strict policy of renewal. He hiked, he read voraciously, he boxed, he hunted, he wrote, he retreated, not despite his enormous responsibilities, because of them. He understood something that most people understand too late. The most responsible thing you can do for the people who depend on you is to remain someone who is capable of being depended upon. Take the long view, protect your energy, know when to stop. Because the version of you that has rested, that has been fed, that has been cared for, that has been allowed to want and to choose and to say no, That version of you is not less generous. It is more generous. It is the only version that can give sustainably, beautifully, freely, without the hidden cost of your own slow destruction. So, what do you do with all of this? What is the Stoic prescription for someone who has recognized themselves in these 10 patterns and wants to find a way through? The first step is awareness, and you have already taken it. The Stoic tradition begins not with action, but with attention. Marcus Aurelius filled his journals with honest self-examination, not because he was a naturally wise man. He was a man full of self-doubt, fatigue, and temptation, but because he understood that you cannot change what you refuse to see. Look at where you are giving from. Look at whether it comes from fullness or from fear. Look at whether the giving leaves you enlarged or diminished. Be honest. The mirror does not lie. The second step is genuinely learning to use the word no, not as a rejection, not as a wall, but as a boundary, which is different. A wall keeps everything out. A boundary says, this far, and I remain myself. Practice it. Say it quietly at first. Say it in situations where the stakes are low. Build the muscle. Because like every muscle, it will feel weak and shaky at first, and powerful and natural later. And every no you say to something that diminishes you is a yes to something that restores you. The third step is to schedule yourself. This sounds almost insultingly simple, but it is one of the most powerful things you can do. Put yourself in your own calendar. Give yourself blocks of time that belong to you, and only you, for rest, for creative work, for the pursuits that make you feel alive. And defend those blocks with the same energy you would bring to protecting anyone else's time. Because you are not less important than the people you help. You are equally important, and it is time you started acting like it. The fourth step is to audit your relationships, not with cruelty or judgment, but with clear eyes. Ask yourself honestly, who in your life gives as much as they take? Ask yourself, who shows up for you the way you show up for them? Ask yourself who you feel energized after spending time with, and who you feel depleted by. And then, gradually, deliberately, without drama, redistribute your energy accordingly. Pull toward the people who fill your tank. Create distance from the people who only drain it. And through all of it, come back to this. The central insight of Stoic philosophy, the thing that Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca all circled back to again and again across thousands of pages, written in different centuries and different languages and different circumstances. You are not responsible for what happens to you, but you are absolutely, completely, inescapably responsible for what you choose to do about it, including the choice to finally stop handing yourself away. The world does not need more martyrs. It does not need more people hollowing themselves out in the name of goodness. What the world needs, what the people around you actually need, is for you to be genuinely whole, to be rested, to be resourced, to be the kind of person who gives not because they are afraid to refuse, but because they have chosen to, from a place of abundance, with full knowledge of what they are giving and why. That is not selfishness. That is the most radical form of generosity there is. And it starts with the recognition that the kindness which destroys you is not kindness at all. It is self-erasure, and the world has lost enough of you already.